In the first shot, we will see actor Lloyd Bacon as a floorwalker talking to a customer in an artificial and unctuous fashion. After the customer departs, Bacon quickly reveals the true nature of his personality as he angrily berates his employees. Mean rather than helpful, this floorwalker will prove to be self-serving, suspicious, and guilty of a crime. His behavior will set the tone for how the principal characters react towards one another throughout the film. In some ways, Chaplin explores what later would be found in the world of Alfred Hitchcock, in that the characters of the floorwalker are guilty of something, suspected of being guilty, or treated as being guilty when they are not. With the introduction of the drinking fountain, we see that this setting also resembles what would be the world of Buster Keaton, in that machines often turn against people rather than serve them. In this intriguing close-up, motion picture audiences were introduced to Eric Campbell for the very first time. Despite his grotesque makeup, Campbell's expression suggests an actor with the potential for drama. The dramatic tone of this scene establishes an interesting situation where guilt becomes a motivating factor in a slapstick comedy. As Michael J. Hayde notes in his book Chaplin's Vintage Year, The History of the Mutual Chaplin Specials, Campbell was appearing on Broadway in a comic opera entitled Pom Pom, which opened on February 28, 1916, when he was seen by Charlie Chaplin and his brother Sid. Following the show, Charlie offered Campbell a contract to appear in his new Mutual film comedies, and Eric immediately accepted. The Chaplin brothers were in New York so that Charlie could sign his $670,000 contract with the Mutual Film Corporation on February 25th. Sid, who was his brother's manager, had arranged this contract, which made Charlie Chaplin the highest salaried entertainer in the world. New York City would provide Charlie Chaplin with another gift besides the hiring of Eric Campbell and the signing of a lucrative movie contract. Chaplin's idea of using comic situations involving an escalator also came to him in New York. More will be said about this escalator later. One question that comes to mind at this point in The Floorwalker is, where's Charlie? Most Chaplin films employ his famous film character as the focal point from the very beginning. We're about 1/10 of the way into this movie, and we still haven't seen Charlie. Instead of initially concentrating on Charlie, Chaplin, as a director, focuses on ensemble acting with other cast members to first establish the atmosphere of suspicion and guilt that will raise questions about the motives and identity of the eccentric Charlie once we see him. In this scene, where Charlie is finally introduced, the comic business with the mannequin leg suggests the influence of Brother Sid. While featured in a poster, Charlie Chaplin did nothing else with this prop in The Floorwalker. However, a comparable mannequin leg is the basis for one of the most notable gags in a 1915 Sid Chaplin Keystone comedy, A Lover's Lost Control, which was also set in a department store. At one point in that Keystone picture, Sid's character of Gussel is stroking a mannequin's leg while sitting next to a girl in the shoe department. Given the position of the leg, shocked onlookers in the store believe that Gussel is stroking the limb of the girl. British performer Fred Goodwins joined Chaplin's stock company when the comedian was working at the S&A Film Manufacturing Company, and Goodwins remained with the comedian when Charlie moved to Mutual. A newspaper writer as well as performer, Goodwins wrote some fascinating first-hand observations regarding Chaplin at work in both the later S&A films and his transition into making the Mutual comedies. I'm particularly grateful to Glenn Mitchell for putting me on to David James' essay entitled When I'm Trying to Be Funny, I'm All Wrong, Chaplin in the Red Letter, which was published in the journal Early Popular Visual Culture. This essay reveals a series of articles on Chaplin that Goodwins wrote for the 1916 British women's magazine, The Red Letter. The fact that the wind has been blowing this dress is a reminder that these interior shots were filmed outdoors so that they could be shot in natural light. After meeting Chaplin on the set prior to the first day of shooting, Fred Goodwins was to remember, "During the next 3 days the weather was misty and rainy, and work was out of the question. But the sun broke through at last, and the company, for the first time in 8 weeks, donned grease paint and crepe hair, and once more the wheels of a Chaplin comedy factory began to revolve. I don't think Charlie really intended to do anything in the nature of breaking a record that day, but nevertheless he did so. For the first scene we shot, his entrance and preliminary gag was 310 feet long without a cut or break. Considering that this will run 5 minutes and 10 seconds upon the screen when it comes to be shown, the average picture goer will agree that this is probably the longest continuous scene that has ever been taken. Surviving outtakes from the Floorwalker, first made known through Kevin Brownlow and David Gill's invaluable 1983 documentary series Unknown Chaplin, and the finished film itself, raise questions about Goodwin's account. We'll address this shortly. In this scene, Charlie, who is eccentric and accident-prone but not a thief, is getting all the attention while better-dressed shoplifters are stealing the store clean. One of the shoplifters is played by Leo White. Chaplin filmed White doing this business over 6 times and focused on the shoplifter spitting. Every version of the Floorwalker that I've seen has a jump cut where White's spitting has been removed. As David James observed in his article, Fred Goodwins was serving as a Chaplin publicist as well as sharing film history when writing these articles, and his comments need to be taken in this context. The earliest numbered slate in the Floorwalker outtakes is number 12, which is Eric's introductory close-up. Chaplin could have filmed Charlie's introduction prior to this take, which clearly would have been important to him, but the outtakes that most resemble Charlie's introductory footage in the finished film are numbered 55 through 58. Chaplin, as a director, certainly would have been curious as to how his new co-star, Eric Campbell, came across on film when he first started shooting. Also, the majority of the outtakes for the Floorwalker were filmed sequentially, in keeping with the development of the narrative, and Eric's introduction occurs at the beginning of this film. Goodwin's readers, however, would have been interested in hearing about Chaplin filming Charlie's introductory sequence rather than that of Eric. So it's not surprising that this publicist commentator might have decided to tinker with the chronology of the actual events to accommodate his readers. The order of the outtakes reflects the priorities of this director at a given time, and it's interesting to note that these shots with assistant Floorwalker Albert Austin and Detective Tom Nelson are part of a series numbered from 67 to 101. The footage we are seeing would have been shot relatively soon after Chaplin filmed Charlie's introductory footage in the series number 55 through 58. This indicates that Chaplin was very efficient in filming the film's opening material. This sequence will end after Charlie goes up the escalator and confronts the crooked Floorwalker, Lloyd Bacon. The last surviving numbered outtake, which is of Detective Tom Nelson and a handcuffed Eric Campbell in the elevator, is number 289, an image that is not in the completed film, but one meant for closure. It's unlikely that there were many shots, if any, photographed after take 289. If we use the numbers of the outtakes for this sequence as a gauge, Chaplin had completed nearly a third of the filming at the point where Charlie rushes up the escalator and confronts Lloyd Bacon. While the Floorwalker and Sid Chaplin's A Lover's Lost Control are quite different in terms of comic execution, the similarity of setting, gags, and comic props indicate that Sid had an influence on Charlie's first mutual comedy. There is additional evidence which also suggests that Sid had a major impact on the Floorwalker. When going through Charlie Chaplin's papers, Lisa Stein Haven found a script that Sid had written, presumably for Charlie's first mutual film. Charlie Chaplin, however, did not tend to follow a script when making his movies at this time. Not surprisingly, Charlie never filmed the plot, which Sid later reworked into the narrative for his now lost 1921 Sidney Chaplin feature, King, Queen, Joker. The earliest surviving slate number for a doppelganger outtake in the Floorwalker is number 28, and the last one is number 44. Given these numbers, the doppelganger scene precedes takes 55 and 58, which introduce Charlie in the toiletry section of the department store, and appear after Eric's introduction was shot. The fact that Chaplin shot this scene early in the filming suggests that this segment was of particular interest to this director. Chaplin would, in fact, revisit the idea of the doppelganger in The Idle Class and The Great Dictator, among other films. This scene, where Charlie recognizes his double in the embezzling Floorwalker, is very similar to a situation where Lloyd Bacon, who is identified by name in Sid's script, was to play Charlie's doppelganger. The double's astonishment in this scene, in the Floorwalker, is particularly affected by the fact that each is currently experiencing an association with guilt. As David Robinson and others have pointed out, variations of this classic doppelganger mirror scene can be found in Max Linder's 1921 feature, 7 Years Bad Luck, and the Marx Brothers' 1933 classic, Duck Soup. In some respects, this particular scene introduces Charlie better than the opening one with the leg from the mannequin. I particularly like the one point here where Lloyd Bacon is asking him who he is, and Charlie makes this sweeping motion to suggest that he's a janitor. The content of the majority of the 16 or so surviving doppelganger outtakes is fairly similar from shot to shot. One of the more interesting of these discarded outtakes is during the scene here, or the part of the shot, where they exchange their clothing. And in one outtake, when Charlie gets behind the padded chair in the back, he falls behind it while he's taking off his pants, resulting in a concerned Lloyd Bacon rushing to see if he's okay. Fred Goodwins discusses the filming of the doppelganger scene in one of his red letter articles and claims it was done as early as the second day of shooting. Goodwin's account is of particular interest given the way he describes Chaplin's efforts in working to make an important scene right. According to Goodwins, upon the second day, Charlie's energy seemed to have taken a relapse, for he was unable to concentrate without sitting down and smoking a cigarette before every scene he shot. Stuff like Charlie's can hardly be turned on tap like water, and neither does consistency play any large part in its making. A whole story will possibly turn upon one chance thought of Chaplin's, and that thought may not come until the story is halfway through. Consequently, an army of men has to be always on hand, ready to execute the bidding that may come from headquarters at any moment. Expensive? You bet it is. But there are more Chaplin comedies sold throughout the world than any other make of picture, so that a few $100s, more or less, make but a little difference in the huge turnover represented by each picture we send off to the plant. Yet it is still out of the question, apparently, to put on a picture without wasting an awful lot of time. Although we were right on the job at the stipulated hour, Charlie was often so lost for the exact routine of a certain situation that he would sit sometimes for hours each day thinking it out. In just such a pensive spell, I have caught him with the camera. And although the attitude he has adopted is far from being a dignified one, he apparently derives a lot of comfort from it. In this part of his commentary, Goodwin refers to a photograph reproduced in David James' essay that this publicist took on the set with Chaplin in costume. He's lying on the bottom of the high-back padded chair that was used in the doppelganger scene. Chaplin's legs are sticking up in the air. The caption under the photo reads, "You'd think Charlie was taking it easy, but as a matter of fact, he's working busily, thinking out a difficult scene." Goodwin goes on to note, "The character immediately behind him, in this picture, is Lloyd Bacon, made up as a double of Charlie. while the other man in this particular snapshot is George Cleethorpe, the head property master nicknamed Scotty. Scotty is one of the few holdovers from the old Chaplin S&A ranks and is a native of the south of Ireland. I don't think I have ever seen Charlie so undecided and fickle as he has been during the past few weeks. He will sit, oftentimes resting his head on his knees or playing with some trivial toy or other upon the counter of the scene, his brain working at a furious rate. In Charlie's most trivial moments, he is thinking his hardest. On the evening of which I am writing, he called off for the day and sent us all to our respective dressing rooms to clean up. Yet, when I returned to the stage, he was still perched on a chair, his knees under his chin, in full makeup. While Chaplin would struggle to finish a Mutual film every month, he was able to complete his first 8 comedies, including The Floorwalker, pretty much on schedule. The last 4 Mutual films would take longer. It quickly became clear that Charlie Chaplin had hired a gem when he added Eric Campbell to his stock company. Campbell provided a very effective Goliath for Chaplin's David, and the two actors had a great rapport. One problem was that they constantly broke each other up, which added to the number of discarded outtakes. Their faces suggest that this situation may be close to happening here. Evidence from the outtakes, Goodwin's observations, and the rejection of the majority of Sid's scenario indicate that Charlie Chaplin improvised comic business during the shooting of his Mutual comedies rather than follow ideas already worked out in a detailed script. This process enabled Chaplin to work much like a choreographer, in this case developing and polishing routines and bits of business before a camera, until the final refined choreography in a given shot eventually emerged. This does not mean that Chaplin never worked from a scenario. The writer Vincent Bryant, lyricist for the famous song In My Merry Oldsmobile, was a story advisor for Chaplin at Mutual. Charlie Chaplin was open to Bryant's suggestions, but he did not want to be constricted by a script if a better story would present itself. During a production, Chaplin would experiment with and then abandon various scenarios, the same way that he discarded some really funny gags that were sacrificed for a more homogeneous overall effect. And he'd do this until he had finally completed his highly polished motion picture. If Chaplin did not rely on a script to construct his story, how did he determine the ultimate structure of a completed film? The outtakes suggest that Chaplin's films evolved through the production and evolution of the individual shots. In an interview given a year prior to his death, the comedian actor Taylor Negrin recalled some advice that Lucille Ball had given him, which she originally had gotten from Buster Keaton. According to Buster Keaton and Lucille Ball, know where the exit is, know the entrances, know your props. Chaplin appeared to have followed these rules when shooting the individual shots of his movies. This director framed the beginning and ending of each shot, which determined its linkage with the rest of the film, while concentrating on how to make the content of what existed in between as effective as possible. In this way, each shot becomes a polished and interesting entity in and of itself, as well as being part of the whole. Because of the importance of this choreographic process in the production of his Mutual comedies, Chaplin's outtakes can reveal how the comedian polished his business while filming variations of each shot, identify the chronology of what was important to this director during a given time in a film's production, and demonstrate how Chaplin's employment of these working methods could produce classic motion pictures. Here we have an example of how Chaplin would develop the comedy in an individual take while establishing links with other parts of the film. We remember the two squirting gags with the faulty water fountain, and Chaplin builds upon this association to create more comic situations involving water in this particular setting. Chaplin had not focused on the hats in this area before, but he is emphasizing them here not only for comic business within this take, but to help set up a scene that he filmed as a possible ending for the Floorwalker, which he didn't use. I'll talk more about that later. Goodwin's mentioned the lengthy 5-minute take that Chaplin supposedly filmed to introduce Charlie, although there is no shot of this length in the Floorwalker. What Chaplin often would do with extensive takes, like the one with the watering of the hats, is to cut to something else before all of the business in that particular run of the camera has been shown. He would then come back to it or a similar take later, thereby converting a single run of the camera into 2 or more shots rather than just one. The shoe department set is another example of something that Sid Chaplin used in A Lover's Lost Control. Sid Chaplin would also use comic business with ankles in his film, but Charlie Chaplin orchestrates this situation differently. For one thing, he incorporates another mechanical prop, in this case a moving stepladder, to join the escalator, the elevator, and the fountain. Then he uses parallel action to cut back to another scene, in this case what Eric's doing. And then after establishing Eric attempting to get away, Chaplin cuts back to the business with the ankle in the shoe department. And now we see a variation of the situation as Detective Tom Nelson is setting Charlie up. More parallel action. Eric is continuing to try and make his getaway. We have the detective in the foreground. He sees her. Match cut as he gets in front of the elevator. Back to the shoe department, and you'll notice we have a tighter placement so that Chaplin can focus on the ankle gag more closely. This also sets up the exit from that particular scene, and we now have another mechanical device being introduced, what was known as a cash railway. And this again was something that Sid Chaplin had in A Lover's Lost Control, except he had the older version, which was a set of tracks and wooden balls called cash balls, and they drop on Sid's head. In this case, Charlie Chaplin is using a more sophisticated device using wires, and these baskets could transport money and packages. Again, we've got the comic situation in these particular shots, and this particular device will also be employed in the deleted scene that I'll be talking about at the end of the film. Our discussion has revealed that Chaplin was exploring some interesting approaches to filmmaking with the Floorwalker, but a good deal of the literature on this film has tended to focus on the escalator. As David Robinson observed in his 1985 seminal biography, Chaplin, His Life and Art, the most gifted publicist in motion pictures, Terry Ramsey, was working for Mutual at the time Chaplin signed his landmark contract. Ramsey's description of Chaplin's association with Mutual had a major impact upon how the comedian was perceived at that time and later. Referring to Ramsey's September 1917 article in Photoplay, Chaplin and How He Does It, David Robinson quotes Terry Ramsey on the birth of the Floorwalker. According to Ramsey, Chaplin only had 3 weeks to decide upon the plot. For 2 weeks and 6 days, Mr. Chaplin wandered about New York. One day, when time was desperately short, he was walking up 6th Avenue at 33rd Street when an unfortunate pedestrian slipped and skidded down the escalator, serving the adjacent elevated station. Everybody but Chaplin laughed. But Mr. Chaplin's eyes lit up. Also, he lit out for the studio in Los Angeles. Thus was the Floorwalker born. Mr. Chaplin did not care a whoop about the Floorwalker as a type. What he sought were the wonderful possibilities of the escalator as a vehicle upon which to have a lot of amusing troubles. The Floorwalker was built upon the escalator, not the Floorwalker. The history of the Floorwalker is, in a diagnostic sense, typical of the building of a Chaplin comedy. Every one of them is built around something. As David Robinson noted, Terry Ramsey went on to write the influential pioneer history of Hollywood, A Million and One Nights, in 1926. And we're very fortunate to have the observations that Ramsey made about Chaplin and his work at that time. That said, Mr. Ramsey's account on the birth of a Floorwalker as a diagnostic Chaplin study raises some questions. Now, one interesting thing here in this scene, before I continue with Terry Ramsey, is that Chaplin is on a wire, and the outtakes show him dangling like a puppet, and he's not particularly excited about that particular situation. So here he's off the wire and a bit more comfortable. Now, getting back to what Ramsey said, why did Chaplin call this film The Floorwalker if he didn't give a whoop about that type of character? The idea that Chaplin didn't give a whoop about any character type flies in the face of the entire body of this respected filmmaker's work. Terry Ramsey was a publicist for Mutual when he wrote his article for Photoplay. The concept of an escalator in a slapstick comedy was quite novel for motion pictures of the time, and it's not surprising that Ramsey, as a press agent, seized upon the birth of the Floorwalker and its use of comic state-of-the-art mechanical spectacle to emphasize current innovation. Those who continue to take the conclusion of Ramsey's diagnostic study at face value could be doing so at this film's expense, since the Floorwalker does more than exploit a mechanical novelty of 1916 for its comedy. One of the interesting aspects of the escalator is the lever, which you see at the bottom here. At one point, Detective Tom Nelson grabs that lever and reverses the direction of the escalator, allowing Eric and Charlie to get off the treadmill. Now, in the deleted footage, there's one scene where a sadistic policeman grabs the lever and pulls it back and forth so that Charlie and Eric are jerked back and forth. You'll also remember there's a scene coming up where the police are shooting at the customers and there's this large woman who runs away. That's actually actor Frank Coleman in drag. In the deleted footage, Coleman is at the bottom of the staircase. Charlie is able to get off the staircase. He knocks Coleman onto the escalator in his place. Charlie then's pulling the lever back and forth, and then at one point he grabs a basket from the cash railway, rides into the area with the hats, doffs a hat, and leaves. This scene would be deleted, and ultimately Chaplin would use the more ambiguous ending of having Charlie in the elevator with Detective Tom Nelson, which crashes down on Eric's head. Expectations were high for Charlie Chaplin's first Mutual comedy, and The Floorwalker did not disappoint. Other Chaplin Mutual classics were to follow.